And of course, that basically ended the war. And so it took Lincoln 3 years to find Grant. And what if he had settled for McClellan? Would he have ever won the war? This is one of the most important aspects of why I think Lincoln was able to win the Civil War in only 4 years and pull the Union back together. And in the election of 1864, he ran against George McClellan, who was now a civilian. And McClellan had got the Democratic nomination, but oddly, Lincoln got the Republican nomination, but he didn't. They ran on the Union ticket. He chose Andrew Johnson as his running mate, who was a senator from Tennessee, and he was a Democrat. And they ran on the Union ticket. He was trying to pull the Union back together, and of course, this time he won handily. Of course, the southern states weren't on the ballot, of course, but McClellan didn't win very much at all. And this is important because Lincoln made sure that the soldiers got to vote. And you would think the soldiers would vote for a general, right? They didn't. They voted for Lincoln because Lincoln had built that relationship with them over the course of the last 4 years. He got over 80% of the soldiers' vote. In his second inaugural, he talked about high hopes for the future, looking forward to trying to bring the Union back together. And of course, about a month later, Appomattox happened and the war ended. And then, of course, we know that within a week, Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater, died the next day. And an interesting point, you know, that the train ride and everything in the morning that was associated with it. And there was one person who stood out and said, "I would like to lead the funeral procession into the cemetery," and that was Joe Hooker, the general that Lincoln had written the letter to and basically been moved aside. And they asked Hooker, "Well, why?" And he said, "Well, that letter was such a letter as a father might write to his son." So he built this relationship with Hooker, and even though he got removed, he still felt greatly about Lincoln. And one of the things that I thought deeply about, and this is not in the book Lincoln on Leadership, because I didn't think about it until afterwards. And that is that Lincoln was able to do something. It will be in the revised edition, I assure you, though. And Lincoln was able to do two things, combine two things that it's tough to do. Is the drive to achieve, which he had, and the capacity to care about people. Lincoln was always pushing. You know, he who achieves something at the head of one regiment eclipses him who does nothing at the head of 100, and yet he would do nothing in malice. And in his second inaugural, when everybody knew what the outcome of the war was going to be, and in the very last paragraph of his second inaugural address, he offered an olive branch to the South. And this is what he said, and it's very moving because it's one of the last public addresses Lincoln made to us. And he wrote it himself, and he said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." And there it is, the very words, to achieve and to care. And when I went to the Lincoln Memorial, I was asked to speak in Washington about Lincoln and the Founding Fathers, and we went to the Lincoln Memorial, and this is after my books had come out, and a ranger's given a talk, and he says, "Now the sculptor symbolized with Lincoln's hands the clenched fist, his determination to hold the Union together, and his open hand, the compassion to let the South back in." And I thought, wow, that's really powerful. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a great story. And what is it? I think I was asked, I can't remember who asked me today. If you had to sum, I think it was Euclid. And if you had to sum up Lincoln's leadership or leadership in general in a minute, I came back to Lincoln's basic character. You know, he was sold as Honest Abe the Rail Splitter, but he really was that honest. And his foundation of leadership was character. He stood on that foundation. And everything he did was based on his character, his honesty, and his integrity. And he is the guy that said, you can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. And the more unknown part of that quote is what he said: if you once forfeit the confidence of your fellow citizens, you can never regain their respect and esteem. One time is all it takes, and that's it. That was Lincoln's basic character. And of course the Gettysburg Address, well, you take a look at Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. It has taken its place among the great American documents of our nation, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. People put it up there. And this was an address that lasted a couple of minutes, 10 sentences, and about 200 words. It was unbelievably eloquent. And Lincoln basically used the past. He said 7 years ago, which took us back to the Revolution. And he took the past and he related it to the present. Today we are engaged in a great civil war. And then he talked about renewal of the nation. He said that from these honored dead, remember he was at the cemetery, we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. And he related that to the future. So that government of the people, by the people, for the people would not perish from the earth. That's, by the way, that's the only picture of Lincoln at Gettysburg that we know of. But I come back to you now and I look at the Lincoln Memorial as some 40 some odd years later. I'm going to tell you exactly how long it was, but I look at that and now I understand why they built the Lincoln Memorial. In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever. And I think of my mother every time I look at that statue. And now I know it was because of her and that memory that this book came about. So I'm so honored again that you asked me to be here today, and I want to thank you for braving the elements and coming out to hear about one of my heroes, Abraham Lincoln. Thank you. I think we have time for some questions. Is that right? Can everybody hear me okay? I'm loaded up with all these microphones. You should be able to hear me. Go back? Okay. So much for technology, right? Yes?
You made a point that Lincoln was decisive, but you also made a counterpoint that he was persuasive. How did those two reconcile themselves?
He always tried to persuade first. He tried to make people understand what he was trying to do, and generally he could build a consensus, and generally he could persuade. He was amazing. There are a lot of stories about how people would go in to talk to Lincoln when he was president, and they were bound to determine that he wasn't going to turn them around, and he would. So and I find this a common element in a lot of the leaders that I've studied, and one of the ones that comes to mind is General Eisenhower. General Eisenhower, of course, who later became president, never liked issuing orders. And he said, I never know if somebody's going to really carry out an order or not, so I would prefer to persuade them. And he would talk. He was coaching a young officer one time, and he put a string. This officer was issued a lot of orders and was getting a reputation as a dictator. And General Eisenhower put a string on the desk, on the table, and he said, look, he said, if you push the string from behind, it's just a jumbled mess, It doesn't go anywhere until you get up to the front. But if you pull it, the string goes nicely along. He said, that's the way you should lead. You should pull people and not push them. And that involves persuasion, it involves inspiration, it involves work. It's hard work to do that. A lot of people don't want to do it. But Lincoln did that, and he did it frequently. But he wasn't afraid to issue an order. And he would listen to everybody, and then he would make up his mind and make a decision. And his decision-making process was real interesting. He was very deliberate. Very rarely made spot decisions right away. He would get all the facts, take them into account. He would review them. He would get consultation. He would involve people, ask them for their opinions. Then he would determine is this consistent? Are these possibilities consistent with my objectives and my policy? And then he would make a decision. He would communicate that decision. It's a pretty basic process.